Hello, Namaskar, and a very good evening to all the viewers watching our session out there. Welcome to NCERT's live interactive session. This is your host for the session, Simran Singh. You are all watching this particular session on PM eVidya channel number 6 to 12, and you can also connect with us through our YouTube channel, that is NCERT Official. So it's around 4 p.m. on your watch, and regularly from 4 to 5 p.m. we come up with certain special sessions to enhance your understanding about diverse fields. So once again, I welcome you in the 4th day of our special online training series that we are running on digital pedagogy. Well, the session started out on 25th of July until 29th of July, that is for 5 days. We are conducting these special sessions. CIT NCERT is having them for you in collaboration with the UNESCO MGIEP, which is UNESCO's Category 1 Research Institute that focuses on Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 towards education for building peaceful and sustainable societies across the world. And here we are having these particular sessions for all our viewers so that you can learn a lot and integrate the pedagogical approaches, the practices in your classroom experiences. So today's topic is going to be design digital learning experience. Let me also take you through all the areas that we have discussed so far in this 5 days online training session. So on the first day, we discussed about the concept, scope and policy perspective. Then on second day, that is on 26th of July, we provided you all the information regarding how to engage learners digitally. And on the third day of our online training on 27th of July, you got to know about how to navigate responsibly on internet. And today, the topic is going to be design digital learning experience, and tomorrow, that is our concluding day of this 5 days online training session. So we will provide you the information regarding how to empower learners using digital assessments. So here, before beginning our presentation for today's session, let me introduce you to all the panelists that we have in this conversation. We have two guests over here. So the first one is Ms. Shraddha Rawat. Namaskar, ma'am. Good evening again. Welcome to NCERT's live interactive session.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am is Associate National Project Officer, Teacher Training, UNESCO MGIP, India. Then we also have with us Ms. Shreya Tiwari. Namaskar, ma'am.
Namaste.
Welcoming you once again. Ma'am is also Associate National Project Officer at Teacher Training from UNESCO MGIP, India. And you all know that throughout our live interactive sessions, there are certain mediums through which you can connect with us. The first one is you can mention all your queries, your feedback in the comment section of NCERT Official. Besides, here is the contact number that is flashing on your screens. It is 8800440559, and also a mail desk help ID for all of you, that is training.helpdesk@ciet.nic.in. So again, if you have any of the queries, I am emphasizing it, then you can write down to us in the comment section of NCERT Official. For this particular session, for the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll try to take all your queries. And again, as it's the second last day of our 5 days online training session, means it's the 4th day. So we also have a post-session activity for all of you that will be released after we complete tomorrow's session. So till then, stay tuned and wait for it, and do watch all our sessions very keenly, because questions of the quiz will be formed from our sessions itself, and if you score over 70%, then you'll also receive a certificate. Well, शुरुआत करते हैं अपने आज के सत्र की. The topic that we have for today is design digital learning experience. But before beginning that, Shraddha ma'am, I would request you to please take our viewers through the recap of the sessions that we have conducted so far, and then we can proceed with this topic.
Right. Thanks so much, Simran. I think Simran has beautifully consolidated, the topics that we've covered since day one. What I'll do is talk about what we discussed in yesterday's session and how it's connected to what we are going to discuss today. So if we can have the slides. What we were talking about yesterday was really the power of internet or the web. And our effort was to encourage all the teachers to be part of the community on the web. And we did that by talking about number of benefits of being online and participating online. So we spoke about how we can use the web to share our views, share our experiments, our innovations, share our photos, but also a little bit about our personal life and how that can help us in connecting with other people, also keeping in touch with our students. We spoke about sharing our ideas, trying to, cause social impact by starting, campaigns with our learners, trying to bring real world change, etc. So lots of different possibilities on the web. We also spoke about 3 types of skills. Although navigating the web requires many different types of skills, but we focused on 3 skills yesterday. The first one was around creating digital identity. So we explored the concept of what it means to build a digital identity, why we should have one, how can we build a positive digital identity. We also spoke about the importance of digital etiquettes, what it means and why it's important. And lastly, we spoke about evaluating the credibility of the information that we see online. So not everything that we see online is true. What are the skills required to be able to understand what is true and what is not true? So we spoke about a framework called SIFT, and I hope that you found the session useful. If you missed out the session, you can go back and view it again. Today, we are going to take from where we stopped yesterday. We were talking about web and how we can use it within our classroom, but also outside for our professional development. Today, our focus will be on our learners. So how do we design learning experiences utilizing technology to make learning more effective, more engaging, more impactful? And I'd like to hand over.
To do that, what we are going to do today is firstly talk to you about something called as a Universal Design for Learning, a UDL. You might think that every time we come, there is always some or the other acronym that we are coming with. So today's acronym is UDL. I'm pretty sure most of you would know what UDL is. If you don't, then today we're going to talk about it in some bit detail. And for those of you who already know about it, this might be a nice revision for you. So we're going to talk about UDL today. We are also going to talk about a very important element that helps design powerful learning experience called barriers. So we're going to talk about these barriers and then what are the kind of tools that can be used to overcome these barriers in our children. Finally, basis a question that came last time, how does one choose the right tool if they are bombarded with so much information and so many applications and so many tools? Then we have a very quick framework that we'd like to share with you called the honeycomb, and that's something we're going to talk about at the end of the session. We would also want, just like the previous days, as many questions as you can, as many comments and reflections as you can. We'd love to hear what you are thinking as we are talking. So, can we have the presentation, please? All right. So, what is it that we are going to talk about today? Today's central question that we're trying to answer or find a collective answer to is, how do we design learning that is impactful and engaging? Impactful because it needs to create the impact that is intended, and engaging because learners need to be engaged in what they're learning and own their own learning, right? And a very important question, which is kind of a hidden question in a digital pedagogy workshop, is, does technology always have to play a role in it? Just because it's digital pedagogy workshop, it does not necessarily mean that it has to have technology always integrated. But that's an answer that we request you to find out by the end of this session. So, okay, you have an image on your screen, right? You can see, thank you. You can see 3 images placed side by side. Our question to you is, and please write on the chat box, which design of the stadium do you think suits most people? I'm pretty sure as you're watching it and observing it and analyzing it, you'd be writing in the chat box. But here's what I'm going to share with you over the several workshops that we have done and the kind of responses we have received. Most people tend to agree that design number 1 is not okay, because it's clearly not allowing access to the stadium. So can we have the slide up, please, again? Thank you. So the design number 1, which is the picture on the left, is clearly not allowing access to one child and kind of a limited access to the one in the center and clear access to the one in the first. Now what happens is the picture number 2 and the picture number 3 are mostly debated. That's what we found in most of our workshops, and we often find different responses. But most often than not, we have found a clear unanimous agreement that stadium designed in the picture 3 is much better suited than the stadium designed in picture number 2. Now why is that? Essentially, if you see in terms of the kind of impact that's being caused, all the 3 learners are able to watch the ongoing match with equal clarity. Whereas in image number 3, although they are seeing the kind of clarity, the design of the stadium tends to have lesser resources, additional quick fixes that may be needed. Now that's what we want to bring your attention to. While one can argue that stadium image 2 versus stadium image 3, 2 may be better because it's having the same outcome as the third one, but we would like to argue instead that image 3 is reflective of a design. The design of equal access, the design that allows equal participation, and a design that has been made by keeping in mind potential barriers, which means a person who's designing the stadium would have probably first thought, hey, who are the kind of people who are going to be watching it? Is it going to be equally accessible to everyone? And then the design of the net may have come in versus the second image where the stadium design has been made and then realizing that, oh, there is a problem here, we need additional resource, and that's when the boxes have to be put in and additional resource and energy has to be put in. So therefore what we are trying to say is a very central principle of the universal design for learning. Emphasis on the word universal design, right? So a design that is universally suited to all kind of learners in all kind of settings, and how do we create such a scenario for learning? And the very central idea of UDL is that it preempts barriers in learning. That means it starts by identifying the barriers.
Yeah, I also want to add, you know, it's very clear to us what the barriers in context of, like Shreya was sharing an example of the stadium really means, but what do barriers mean in context of learning in our classroom? So let's take an example, right? To understand what these barriers might be and why are we discussing it at all. So simple assignments, you know, for instance, let's say we are talking about a class on digestive system, right? So when we are conducting the class, there may be different learners. We were talking about learner variability, if you remember, that learners have different preferences, they have different needs, etc. So the same of the 40 people, let's say, sitting in the class, some learners may not have very background information that will help them understand digestive system because there are interconnections and they don't have base level information. Let's say the class is being conducted in English. Some learners may have issues in understanding the language, and if the class happened in some other local language, they would probably understand, but this is happening in English and everything is being written in English. Some learners have problems in understanding, like maybe reading. So something that is being drawn on the board, they can't view it properly, or they can't read the word properly, or maybe they can't pronounce it properly. Maybe some learners have some kind of emotional barrier at that point. Maybe something happened in the house and they're sitting in the class, so they're not able to pay attention to what is being taught. So these are just couple of examples of what different kinds of barriers may be. To see barriers from a different lens. Now anything, any activity that happens in class, let's say a simple activity of just getting students to do group work on, let's say, presenting something around digestive system, requires everyone to have multiple skills. What are these skills? So it requires them to do some research, some reading somewhere, putting everything on chart. It requires teamwork, it requires writing skills, perhaps it requires some drawing skills, some coordination, some planning. So a simple group work activity requires bunch of different skills. If a learner has lack of some skills, and some people may be excellent at group work, right, and they take roles accordingly. Some people may be excellent at something, but they also may have a lack of certain kinds of skill. When there is a lack of certain skills required to do an activity, there is a challenge that comes, right? So what essentially this framework is trying to say is, as designers of a learning activity, can we preempt, can we think about what different skills are required that may be missing, so therefore what kind of challenges may learners face when they are undertaking this activity or trying to learn this subject. If we can preempt those challenges, we can begin to design learning experiences that will address these challenges, and we'll get to how they can be addressed very quickly. And if we can learn to preempt these challenges and then design our lesson plans or our activities or our assignments or even our learning material, we can create empowering learning experiences that include all the different kinds of learners, that can support different kinds of learners in addressing their unique challenges, right?
So that's very important. I think what I am learning from what you were saying, Shraddha, is the emphasis on the fact that even though an activity may seem very simple at the face of it, something as simple as a test on Monday or an assignment submission on a Monday, which is in future, which is probably on the 2nd of August. Now to be able to achieve that, you're saying there are so many skills that are needed for the child, and the teacher then becomes more aware of the barriers that each child may be facing. Then the teacher may need to break down that activity into several parts and identify the potential barriers.
Absolutely. And actually we were talking about the importance, even in context of the second session, talking about the importance of observing the variability, of being mindful and observant of, you can only get a glimpse or begin to preempt it when you are really observing your learners.
Sure.
So definitely that. But what are some of the questions that can really help? And these are just a couple on the screen now. A couple of questions that we can ask to begin to identify these kind of learning barriers or challenges. So one thing, will they experience challenges in expressing their knowledge? Now some learners may find it difficult to express their knowledge. So when we create an assignment that requires everyone to only write and express what they know, we can preempt that some learners, and actually a teacher spoke about this in our last session, about there being a student in the class who's great when they're speaking, but when it comes to writing they struggle. So how do we design assessments or assignments that enable different learners to express what they know? So that's one barrier that can help us think about, that's a question that can help us think about barriers and then design flexible experiences. Another question, will learners have trouble with comprehension? Now if there's an information I'm presenting, what kind of challenges may different learners face when they are trying to understand this information, take this information, right? So it could be language, it could be symbols, it could be vocabulary, many things, right? It could be lack of some background knowledge, there could be many things. Do they need additional background information to understand the concept? Again, regarding comprehension, that could be a question. Will learners feel disengaged? Like if there is an activity that involves everyone to read a 15-page PDF document, there is a question you can ask. Some learners may enjoy it, right? There's no judgment, but some learners may feel disengaged. It's for us to ask these questions so that we can begin to identify the learning barriers, right? So,
and would you recommend a teacher asking, whom do you recommend the teacher asking these questions to? To the learners themselves or to one's own self?
I think it would always be a mix. Sometimes as teachers, observing teachers, we already have insights into these, but sometimes we feel we may know enough, but we don't. And I think, in the second session, we spoke about a couple of tools that are available online freely to understand learners' variability, their preferences, their needs, etc.
Yes, and tomorrow we are also going to talk about the role of formative assessments, which kind of help get a peep into how a learner is thinking. So that's something we are also going to talk about tomorrow. But essentially coming back to barriers, as you were saying, Shraddha, I'm hearing 3-4 broad categories, if I may say.
Yeah.
Barriers that can be social, barriers that can be probably around organizing one's own self and one's own time, barriers that can be probably
comprehension.
Around comprehension,
Yeah.
right? It could be around just accessing engagement, right? So accessing information, accessing knowledge.
Also expressing.
And expressing how, that's true. So expressing what I know, that itself could have barriers.
Absolutely.
So you're ranging, your questions have told us how there's a range of barriers. And for the teacher, of course, the tasks become even more difficult.
Yeah.
It's not easy, it becomes more complex, I would say. And allow us to now tell you about something called as the UDL cycle. So what is the UDL cycle talking about? Can we please have the slide? Thank you.
And yeah, before proceeding in the conversation, I would like to inform all our viewers that in this particular session, we still have around 30 minutes left. So if you have any queries, any feedback, any reflection to the questions of our experts, do feel free to write down to us in the comment section of NCRT Official, and in the later segment of our session, we'll try to take all your queries. Yeah, ma'am, you may proceed.
Thank you, Simran. That was so important. So, we were talking about UDL. How do we use this information from the barriers, from what we spoke about earlier in learner variability, what we spoke about yesterday about accessing the web, responsibly. How do these all come together? What form do they take to take shape in the classroom as you go on to teach your learners? Now that's where we want to introduce the idea of the Udl Design Cycle. Now this may sound heavy, but we assure you most of you are already practicing this. For those of you who are not, that's all right too. We are all learning, and maybe there is something that you find which could be a newer step, right, when you design. So here's what the UDL cycle looks like. Without much emphasis on what UDL is, just remember, for those of you who don't know, UDL is about first identifying a barrier in learning, right? Barrier can be anything that Shraddha spoke about. In order to achieve a certain objective, which could be my goal, as a teacher, my role becomes to identify what is a potential block point or a potential barrier or a potential area that a child may get stuck at in order to learn or achieve that objective, right? So that's what barriers mean. So step one, clearly, as most of you know, is developing and setting a goal. You know what these goals are, you design it on a daily basis. It's basically what is it that you want to achieve, right? You then identify the barrier that a teacher that the student might be facing and the teacher wants to address. Now step 3, how do you develop assessments around it? Now most often we have assessments that are drawn at the end, right? And they're mostly given. But I want to quickly draw your attention to this, and this is something that we are going to talk about in detail tomorrow. But the role of assessments, we have to make sure as teachers that assessments are so integrated and so part of our daily action that the assessments are giving the teacher the insight of how the child is learning. Assessments do not necessarily mean a paper pencil test, right? It can take several forms which are also fun, which are also engaging, and can also be probably game-like, or several other types which we are going to talk about. But essentially I want to bring your attention to the fact that when you're defining barriers, it's important to think of assessments then. Let me give you an example. For an example, I have a child in my class and I'm teaching grade 4 mathematics. And I am trying to teach the idea of place value. Now to teach place value, I may have a child who's still struggling with number sense, which means a child may still be needing concrete objects to be able to play around and manipulate to be able to arrive at the next iconic phase, which means representation, right? Now, if there's a child who's there, whose barrier is a symbol, for example 6, but still needs 6 beads, you know that's the barrier that she is currently facing. There's another child who's understood the concept of 6, right? Now, how do you distinguish assessment between the two? Does this mean that you will still take an assessment which is a paper pencil asking how does one represent 6? I would say no. That's exactly where you need to practice your wisdom and build assessments which are so flexible that allow for the child who's still in the phase of using beads to understand what sixness means to her and demonstrate what sixness means to her. Similarly, for the other child who is in the abstract phase, is able to understand the meaning of the symbol 6 and demonstrate her understanding of 6. That's where your role comes in. It's not about what the system wants, it's about what you choose for your classroom, for your child. That's step number 3. Now, about the step number 4, it's pretty simple. It's what you do on a daily basis, developing flexible methods. Can we have the slide back, please? Developing a flexible method and teaching learning material, which you already know and probably already doing. And more often than not, you will realize that the barriers you have identified will influence the material that you use. So, for example, the case of the first child, you will need to make sure that there are enough beads available for the child to engage, and for the child to enough probably paper and pencil available or worksheets available to engage her. So how do you therefore also design flexible methods and materials? That's the reason step 3 is assessments and step 4 is material rather than vice versa. Now step 5 is of course to implement, which you all do and are amazing at. Step 6 is also very important. Now that your cycle of implementation is complete, it's very important, and we urge you to go back and think about how your class went. Did it go as you wanted it to go? Did the barriers really get addressed, or do you think some newer barriers emerged for you? And it's all right. It will always be changing. It will always be dynamic, and it will always be evolving. So your children are growing. With every barrier that you're removing, something new might come up. So it's okay if you don't get it right every time, but it's important to make sure that you're reflecting back on the experience that you are trying to create for your learners. So that's very quickly about the UDL cycle.
Shreya, you spoke about so many different aspects of UDL design cycle, and they're pretty interesting. The two things that really stood out for me, which is very different from the general practices in the education, is one that you're starting with barriers. Generally, once we have a goal, the usual practice is to start designing activities that will meet that goal. What you are saying is basically think about each learner, how they are different, think about the problems they will have, and then design activities that will address those different problems.
Absolutely.
So that's, I think, one thing that stood out for me is think of barriers before designing activities.
True.
And the second word that I noticed in step 4, you spoke about flexible methods. So basically, don't just design great activities, but design flexible activities.
Correct.
So I thought that was really that stood out for me, these two things.
Thank you, that's so important.
Yeah, and so I think taking this forward about, talking about the importance of flexibility and how do we then cater to these different kinds of barriers, and what is the role of technology in addressing these barriers, I think we are now going to, in this section, explore that. So what we are going to do is, there are many different kinds of barriers, and Shreya was just talking about some of the categories of these barriers. But for this, because we have limited time, we are going to pick some barriers, some challenges that are very common across different subjects, classes, grades, etc.
Yeah.
So we'll talk now about the first one, which is associated with reading. Now there's a lot of content on the screen. You may not be able to read everything, but that's just to give you a sense of how many options and tools there are to address barriers on reading. So reading related barriers may be about accessing text. Sometimes there may be learners who are not able to read the text. It may be language related, it may be visual issues, etc. There may be decoding and reading fluency, that vocabulary is not clear, they are not able to understand the formation of sentences are too long or complex, etc. It may be comprehension related, that the content is too complex for some learners, etc. So there may be different challenges vis-a-vis reading. Now what can we do to address these different challenges, and understanding fully well that in a class of 50 students there may be 10 different challenges that learners are facing. Some have comprehension related issues, some have vocabulary, some have etc. things like that. So a couple of tools, digital tools that can help us address these challenges. One I want to mention is text to speech. So sometimes, and this is really purely a personal preference, some people are able to comprehend content better when they are hearing it instead of reading it. And you may know that there are tools like Snap and Read. There are extensions on your simple browser that you're using that can basically, once you open a digital document on your browser, you click on a button or an app, and then that app will basically read the entire document out to you. So you're listening to an audio file, audio recording, instead of reading it, and that can make a lot of difference to your comprehension. It may be easy for learner to understand when they are listening rather than reading.
Interestingly, Shraddha, I'm sure a lot of our learners would also know about all these kind of, newer kind of speakers that are there, which allow you, which read out. So our phones also have that adaptability, right? We don't necessarily need a browser maybe. Even our phones had these text to speech. So you say something and your phone has got it. So I think that technology is becoming so prominent, and then on the left hand side I saw you have so many tools that our teachers can use. We urge you, because we can't walk you through all the tools, we urge you to try some of them definitely. But text to speech, as you're saying.
So there's both text to speech and speech to text, right?
Yes.
In
reading and writing.
We talk about, also we use recording, and that translates. Google Assistant, for example, translates what we are saying into writing. But there are other tools that can also read out the content that has been written, and that's a very useful tool.
Yes, that could be so useful, especially for learners who probably are still struggling with reading, but have a lot of ideas and want to express. So if you as a teacher are trying to understand how my learner is an original thinker, remember how critical thinking or inquiry are such important skills also of our curriculum. And if you find that simple piece of writing is acting like a barrier to a learner, then you can use tools like these, right?
Absolutely. In fact, there are also tools like Smodin, for example, websites that can convert content of one language into the other. Now this, I think, is a lot of teachers may have observed that the learner has great comprehension, but the language is a barrier, because the content is available in English, and if this was available in our local language, or if this was available in Hindi, they would have a whole different understanding of the content. So to know tools like that and to share those tools as well is very useful. Visual organizers also I want to mention. Couple of times learners find heavy content difficult to grasp or to retain, and organizing it into using some graphic organizers or visual organizer can also make content very digestible. So you can also explore some visual organizers that can help with comprehension and reading. Another challenge that learners face are regarding organizing and engagement. I was just giving an example of a group activity, and how a group activity or even preparing for exams take a lot of organizing and and engagement with the content. So the challenges that learner may face is sometimes lack of motivation, sometimes they're not engaged in the class because something happened this morning and now I'm not fully here. So some tools that can help in organizing, an app like Remind and Google Keep, etc., can really help bring all learners in the same platform. Some of the teachers are also using Google Classroom for this purpose, where you can structure assignments so that the learners can visually see how much of this content have they finished, what assignments have they submitted, what is the deadline now. You can also make broadcast announcements reminding everyone that such and such deadline is coming, you should have finished this chapter or submitted your assignment, etc. So it's basically a space using technology to organize our study better, to organize group work, to organize assignments better. We've already spoken about, when we were talking about in the second session about using technology to engage learner, we already spoke about tools like polls, we spoke about Nearpod, offering different, choices to learners to engage. How can we use different technology to offer varying level of difficulty and support? So I won't get into details of how technology can be used to engage learners better. But what are some of the other challenges that come to your mind?
But I think there's one thing that's very important as you were talking about this great list of tools, Shraddha, is the fact that it's not important, and I want to caution all our teachers, just because it's digital pedagogy, it does not mean that every lesson has to have a digital tool integrated. It depends on how you want to design the learning experiences, right? Because I remember there was this confusion that had once come in, and you know, a learner genuinely felt that for every activity that we are doing, how can I find a digital tool? And this engagement that we had with this person was that, where is this coming from? Just because something is called digital pedagogy, we don't have to assume that every experience has to be digital. Right?
I just want to add to that, you know, there were initially, when the whole concept of this is pre-COVID, obviously many years back, when this whole focus in the education about integrating technology came, we were still calling it 21st century learning, right? We were saying that people need to know computers because we are preparing the workers for tomorrow, and therefore we have to bring in technology in our class so that people become comfortable with technology.
True.
When we talk about digital pedagogy, that's a whole different perspective, because we are here talking about using technology to enrich learning experience, not just to teach technological skills to learners. So therefore, and you were talking about universal design for learning, it starts with the goal. We have to really think, do we need technology to meet that goal? Do we need technology to address a learning barrier? Maybe someone's barrier is really that there's something terrible happening at home and they're not able to focus on study.
And they just need someone to talk to.
And
maybe
is that
just
a barrier that
basic.
technology can address? You know, completely not. So to also understand that there are certain barriers that can be addressed by technology and certain barriers that cannot be. And to really see
the purpose, I would say. The purpose of using becomes most important rather than just going around blindly finding a tool, because you will find many tools. I also want to quickly draw your attention. We are in the last 3 minutes and we want to close for questions. Something that came in as a question in our last session on day 2, how do we identify which tools to use? While Shraddha and we've just spoken about the purpose being the central focus for you as a teacher to decide whether or not a tool is needed. That becomes most important, and once you have decided that a tool is needed, how do you navigate through this wide variety that exists in front of you? Here's a framework called the honeycomb, and because there's such lack of time, we recommend you to please go back and definitely read up more on this, or connect with us on the chat with more questions, or visit the course that we offer called The Digital Teacher on framerspace.com, where you will find greater details of this. But very quickly, this framework talks about 7 essential elements. Now, these 7 essential elements are fairly easy to understand. First of all, I would say, is the tool free? While it doesn't say free here, it says it under accessible, but it says in point number 5, I would say that, you know, that's something that I definitely look for. If I'm using a tool, is it a free tool or not, and whether all my children can access it at no cost. So that becomes one of the most important things under accessibility. But is it usable? Is the tool easy to use? Second, is the tool useful in achieving the goal that I have set, the purpose? Does it meet my purpose, right? Is it engaging enough for a learner? So for example, if you are using a tool which you would have otherwise, you know, it's like if you would have otherwise just spoken about, and similarly you play a lecture on YouTube, it's probably the same experience. Is it as engaging? Perhaps you talking as a teacher would be more engaging for the learner. So it's very important to understand the desirability of the tool by understanding how engaging it is. Is it findable? Which means, is it easy for the child, for the learner to find support, how to use the tool, demonstrations around it? So is it findable, right? I spoke about
one. Are you talking about the availability of tutorial to be able to use that tool?
Yes, I think that's the correct word.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay.
I agree. So there has to be some demonstrations and tutorials available,
Right.
so children can also quickly navigate through and learn how to use that tool. Accessibility we spoke about. Is it free? Does it need internet access? There are several tools available which can be used offline as well, and when the device comes in network, it kind of syncs up to the cloud. So that's accessibility. Is it credible? Is it capturing, storing some data with some malintentions? So we have to be very clear that it's a credible company, it's a credible device, right? The privacy laws are okay. Finally, is it valuable? So if you would want some of your content to be taken away, for example, for assessments purposes, then is it really adding value to you or not? Or is it just so much data of printouts that have come to you and you have to sit and analyze them? Is that really worth your time? So it's important to make sure of these things when you start identifying which tool do I want to use for which purpose. With that, we'd like to close officially for today and move into a question and answer session.
Yes, of course.
Yes,
That is
Simran.
so great of you. Today we have plenty of time to take all your queries, and I'm sure that our experts would be more than happy
Always.
to answer all those queries. We still have 10 minutes in the conversation. I have jotted down some of the questions from the comment section. You can still keep on mentioning your questions and we'll try to have an appropriate answer to them. So let's dive into the questions. The first one is in terms of the barriers that you were discussing. So one of our viewers says that today we say a lot about inclusive education. Particularly by inclusive education, he means children with special needs. That involves students from diverse backgrounds irrespective of their physical barriers. Now, how to try and include all those kids in the classroom scenario?
Okay. I'll take that and
Please
you can add. Yeah. So I want to just mention that, there was a time when we were talking about inclusive education only in terms of we would call one mainstream class and then there are children with disabilities or children with special needs, right? Now it's time when we acknowledge that every child has special needs.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're talking when we're talking over and over about learner variability. While some person may have maybe, some learning disability, we also need to acknowledge that every child may have a different kind of learning barrier. So there may be other children who you would think of as mainstream children, but they may also have comprehension related problems. So it's a whole range, and I would urge you to think about inclusive education not just as a classroom that's integrating children with special needs and so-called mainstream children, but as a whole range which includes all kinds of children with their own needs for different supports, with their own preferences, with everything, barriers related to, again, we were talking about comprehension, reading, writing, social and emotional barriers, etc., all of that. So one would be just to think about inclusive as a more inclusive term. But how do we address these kind of barriers? So I think we spoke about couple of technologies today that can help in addressing barriers related to reading, writing. We spoke about barriers related to planning, organizing, engagement. But there are also a lot of technologies that can support learners who are having auditory challenges, who are having visual challenges. There's a whole movement of creating accessible digital books. In fact, UNICEF is running this big program of creating accessible digital books where there are graphic organizers for people who find it very difficult to take in a lot of information. There's also, you can zoom in and enlarge books. You can also highlight, the keywords are highlighted. You can also just click on a button and hear the auditory recording instead of reading it. You can also click on a difficult word and see the meaning. So there's a whole lot of technology that is helping in creating more inclusive resources and classrooms.
And of course, I would like to add to that CIT NCERT from Monday to Friday. In case if you have any queries, then again I'll emphasize that in each of our sessions there is an option to write down your questions in the comment section and we are there to address it. Well, thank you so much, ma'am. Moving forward in the conversation, so our next question is, teachers work hard to deliver the concept in the best possible manner. Yes, we would like to believe so, but at times lack of support from the parents feel disheartening. What should be the right approach from the parents? How to make them understand that it is very important for their kids to keep on changing and evolving with time?
You want to take that, Shreya?
Now that's a very specific place you are coming from, clearly. I don't know what to say except for just the fact that I think each individual, each human being comes with their own conditioning and their own experiences. And I know that as a teacher, one of very important stakeholders that you are dealing with is also the parent community. And it's part of the school leadership as well as the teacher leadership within you to make sure and treat that your parents are equally a stakeholder just like your learners. and maybe try to engage with them on what are their barriers. Maybe there are barriers that you can find and start addressing. Maybe they are coming with their own conditioning which is making them, which is acting like a barrier in perceiving certain information, and let's see how we can address that. Very quickly, I also want to, on this note, just talk about the previous question that you had talked. Just on inclusivity, I would want to urge you to read this very interesting book called Toto-chan. And it has a wonderful example about how a sports day can be organized, where every child, physically challenged or not, any special need or not, every child can still find a way to win in a sports day. And imagine sports with such a typically competitive idea, but just how do we still therefore remove barriers and enable each person's variation and celebrate the variability so that each child ends up winning. Yes, back to you, Simran.
The next one in the line that we have is, how can we handle students with inferiority complex or superiority complex in a classroom scenario?
That's a beautiful question, and I'm so glad you're thinking about it, you know. As a very average student myself when I was in school, I think I wish I was in the classroom of a teacher who's asking that question. Just wanted to first appreciate you for asking that question.
To identify that.
Yeah, to identify that people are feeling the way they are feeling. I think, you know, when we are talking about, in this context, talking about flexible assessments, flexible design, flexible methods, the idea really is to appreciate the uniqueness of each child. So if imagine there was a space where, and Shreya was talking about this in context of sports, but also if there was a way of learners to express what they know in their own way, in their own style, in the manner that they feel most comfortable, what impact would that have on their own, on their confidence and their self-perception?
True.
So, you know.
So where is the superiority coming from?
Yeah.
It's almost like asking ourselves that question. You know, remember about reflection, we're talking about learner variability?
Yeah.
Right? So what about that child makes her feel superior?
Yeah.
What about that other child who's making her feel inferior? What can we do to make sure that the child who's feeling inferior has qualities which are also celebrated in the class?
Exactly.
How would that make her feel? I think it's about, as a teacher, your role becomes too much, I guess, but just to make sure that this culture that is setting in the classroom, that also gets addressed by using the tool of learner variability.
Yeah.
Let's have a last question of this session, as we are not left by much time in the
Sure.
conversation, just 2 more minutes to go. So how can ICT bridge the gap between the learners who have slightly low level of learning, maybe due to the economic reasons or the financial background, and the child who has ample resources? So when they come in the same classroom scenario, how to eliminate that knowledge gap in both of those students with the help of ICT?
Again, that's a beautiful question, and I'm glad that this is also the last question. It really sums up what we've been talking about. That, you know, we've all been designing learning experiences in a very standard way. I would say that we design activities and we think everyone would participate in one way. Everyone will talk one by one, they'll share, one by one they'll write, one person will present, or everyone will write. So we are designing activities imagining everyone is at the same level. I think what technology is helping us do now is first is a mindset shift. So to consider, to observe that learners have different kinds of support needs. And because it's so difficult also for a teacher to address each person's support, technology is actually like my aids. As a teacher, I can use technology as an aid. So there's some challenge that I can address, but giving the right technology to the person who needs additional support, they can actually use that to come to a place where, you know, everyone is able to perform, you know, or to complete the assignment, or to learn what they're supposed to learn, to meet the learning goal. So I think to take a simple example of an assignment. Now let's say I'm giving a question to everyone and asking everyone to write an essay. Can I attach support material within that essay to consider that some learners may need some more background information before they can write this essay? That's something that technology really helps us to do. Embed supports within the design of our learning material, within the design of our assessments. And this is a very different way of designing. So I completely understand. Imagine a classroom where people are using different tools It's not one activity and one instruction that's going out to learners. They're using different activities. It's a very different kind of classroom. So just want to invite you to consider that kind of diverse classroom that celebrates diversity, provides the right support.
See, there is a lot to discuss. We have so many questions, so many queries. People from different parts of the country, they join with us in the conversation and they have their own type of questions. But somehow I'm getting this feeling that they might have different language. But more or less the barriers or the problems that they are facing is common.
Yes.
Again, thank you so much to both of you for being a part of this conversation. So,
you're welcome, Simran, and we love the fact that you have picked up our language of barriers.
So, I would just like to go through these beautiful comments. So, Shams Reza says, thank you so much, ma'am. Such a fruitful session. Thanks for such a wonderful session. Then Deepika ji says that thank you for all those activities and all the areas that you have discussed. Such a useful session. Thank you for the informative session. And lot of thank you messages they are pouring in the comment section.
Thank you.
Thank you to each and every one of you who has been a part of this conversation. We still have one more day to go. That is our last day. And I hope as you are enjoying this conversation, you'll also participate in our quiz. So tomorrow for the concluding day, we'll discuss about empower learners using digital assessments. Now it's time to wrap up this particular session, but you don't have to go anywhere because our upcoming session is Sahyog. So stay tuned and keep watching PM eVidya channels. Namaskar.